The scratching came from inside the wall next to Mary's head at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, and it was not the first time she had heard it. She lay in the narrow servant's bed on the 4th floor of the Caldwell House on Rittenhouse Square, Philadelphia, and listened to something move in a space that should not have existed. The wall was solid plaster over brick, but the sound was unmistakable. Not rats, not pipes, something deliberate. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, pause, like someone testing the surface. Mary Byrne had been in the Caldwell house for 6 days. She was 19 years old, Irish, 3 months in Philadelphia, fleeing poverty that had followed the famine, even 15 years later. The position was supposed to be better than her previous work. A prestigious address, good wages, a household of only 8 servants for a house that could have easily required 15. What the housekeeper had not mentioned during the interview was why the staff was so efficient. The house had passages, hidden corridors running parallel to every major room, allowing servants to move through the structure like blood through veins. Never seen, never heard. Mary had discovered this on her second day when Mrs. Graves had opened what looked like a linen closet and gestured her inside. At the back was another door, painted to match the walls, nearly invisible in the dim light. The corridor beyond was barely wider than Mary's shoulders, unlit except for small vents near the ceiling that let in slivers of daylight from rooms beyond. Unfinished plaster walls, bare wood floors. It ran the length of the house, completely silent. Mrs. Graves had walked ahead without speaking. They passed openings to other passages, junction points where corridors met in darkness. They passed small chambers cut into the walls, each barely large enough for a bed. They passed ventilation grates that looked down into the rooms below. At the far end, they emerged through another hidden door into another closet, adjacent to the bedroom where Mary was meant to deliver linens. 3 minutes to cross the entire house. Unseen. Unheard. Mrs. Graves had not explained. She had simply said that from now on, this was the route Mary would use. All servants used the inner passages. It was how the house functioned. Since then, Mary had learned the basic layout. The 3rd and 4th floors were simplest, single corridors with hidden doors at regular intervals. The 2nd floor branched and reconnected in ways she had not yet fully mapped. The 1st floor and basement were a maze. When she had asked the other servants about the system, they had answered briefly and looked away. The house had been built this way 40 years ago. An innovation. Modern servant infrastructure. Many fine houses were adopting similar designs, but Mary had noticed things they had not explained. The sleeping chambers in the walls. She had counted 12 on the 4th floor alone. 12 chambers for a house that employed 8 servants, only 5 of whom slept inside. The chambers were furnished identically. Narrow bed, small table, chamber pot. No windows. Some showed signs of recent use. Impressions in thin mattresses. Candle wax on tables. But they were empty now. And the doors. Some of the passage doors she had seen locked from the outside. Now, at 3 in the morning, the scratching stopped. Mary lay very still. The silence was worse. She had the sudden certainty that whatever had been scratching was now listening. She did not move. She thought about her aunt's warnings before she had taken the position. Good houses can be bad places for girls alone. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, leave. But leaving required money and a reference, and Mary had neither. Positions that paid enough to send money home did not come easily to Irish girls without connections. The scratching started again. Closer now, directly behind the wall at the head of her bed. Mary sat up slowly. She lit the candle on her bedside table. The flame guttered in a draft that came from nowhere because the room had no windows and the door was closed. She crossed to the wall and placed her palm against the plaster. The scratching stopped immediately. She pulled her hand back. The plaster looked solid, but when she leaned closer, she saw a faint seam running vertically from floor to ceiling. Not a crack, too straight, too deliberate. a join where two surfaces met. She traced it with her finger. The wall gave slightly under pressure, not enough to open anything, just enough to confirm it was not load-bearing plaster over brick. It was a panel, covering something. Mary stepped back and looked at the seam. Then she looked at her door, the one that opened into the servants' passage, and thought about what lay beyond. The maze of corridors, the chambers with beds that had been slept in but were now empty, the locked doors, and she thought about something she had glimpsed during her interview. A staff ledger on Mrs. Graves's desk, open for just a moment before it was closed. Pages and pages of names going back decades, hire dates, departure dates, and in the departure column, the same notation repeated. Resigned. Sought position elsewhere. Resigned. Sought position elsewhere. Dozens of names across 40 years. But Mrs. Graves had said the staff number had been stable at 8 for many years. If the number was stable, why were there so many names? Mary blew out the candle. She got back into bed. The scratching did not return, but the silence had weight now. The feeling of a space that was occupied, of being in a house that contained more than it should. She thought about families who built houses like this, families who wanted their servants invisible, architects who designed spaces for human beings barely larger than coffins. And she thought about what else such spaces could be used for if you wanted to make someone disappear. If you wanted to erase a person from a household without anyone noticing. If you built the infrastructure for invisibility into the house itself. Mary did not sleep. She lay in the narrow bed and waited for morning. When the bell rang at 5 o'clock, she rose and dressed and stepped into the passage. The corridor was dark. The other servants were already moving through the house, efficient and silent. Mary joined them. She followed her assigned route. She did not ask questions, but she began to count. The chambers in the walls, the locked doors, the names in that ledger. And she listened at 3 o'clock every morning to the sound that came from the space that should not exist. The scratching that had rhythm. That had purpose. That came from someone still inside the walls. On the 7th night, the scratching stopped. On the 8th night, Mary found something wedged in the seam of the false wall when she pressed her fingers against it. A scrap of fabric. Wool. Dark blue. Almost black. The kind of fabric used for servants' uniforms in good houses. It was old, the fibers brittle. But when she pulled it free and held it to the candlelight, she saw something that made her hands go cold. Stitched into the corner in thread that had once been white, but was now the color of old bone, were initials. E.M., and beneath them, a date. 4 years ago. Mary looked at the fabric. She looked at the wall. She thought about 12 empty chambers and a ledger full of names and a house that had been efficiently staffed for 40 years. She folded the fabric carefully and hid it beneath her mattress. The next morning, she asked Mrs. Graves if there were any records of previous staff she might review to better understand her duties. Mrs. Graves looked at her for a long moment with eyes that were pale and flat. "The past is not your concern," she said. "Your concern is the work in front of you." That night, the scratching did not come from the wall beside Mary's bed. It came from beneath the floor. Mary found the architectural drawings 3 weeks after she found the fabric. They were not hidden, which was the strange part. They were filed in the butler's pantry, in a cabinet that held table linens and silver inventories and household ledgers going back to the house's construction in 1828. Mr. Tennant had sent her to retrieve the spring entertaining schedule, a task that required opening drawers Mary had not previously been permitted to touch, and there they were. Rolled plans tied with string gone soft with age, labeled in faded ink. Caldwell Residence, Service Infrastructure, J. Carved, Architect, 1828. She did not take them. Not then. She noted where they were and closed the drawer and delivered the schedule to Mr. Tennant, who barely looked at her. But that night, when the house was asleep and the servants were in their chambers and the passages were dark, Mary went back. The plans were extensive. 37 pages of detailed architectural drawings showing not just the main house, but the entire servant infrastructure. The passages she had learned to navigate were all there, rendered in careful cross-section. But there were other passages too. Routes she had not been shown. Staircases that descended past the basement into spaces labeled simply lower service access. Chambers marked with notations she did not understand. Extended secondary accommodation. Isolated preparation space. Long-term storage with ventilation modification. One page showed the 4th floor in plan view. Her room was marked. All the servant chambers were marked. But there were additional spaces drawn in dotted lines, spaces between the walls, accessible through panels that opened from the passages, but not from the rooms themselves. The spaces were small, perhaps 4 feet by 6, marked only with numbers. Chamber 4A, Chamber 4B, running sequentially along the entire floor. Mary traced the dotted lines with her finger. The chamber beside her room was marked 4G. According to the plans, it had a ventilation duct connecting to her room and a door that opened from the passage outside. She had never seen that door, but she had heard the scratching. She photographed the notations in her mind, the way her father had taught her to remember patterns when she was young. Then she rolled the plans carefully and returned them to the drawer and went back through the passages to her room. The scratching had moved. For the first 3 weeks, it had come from the wall, then from beneath the floor. Now it came from above, from the ceiling, in the hours between midnight and dawn. Always the same rhythm, always stopping when she placed her hand against the surface, as if whatever made the sound could feel her presence through the plaster. She had stopped sleeping more than an hour at a time. The other servants had noticed. One of the older housemaids, Catherine, had asked if she was unwell. Mary had said she was adjusting to the position. Catherine had looked at her with something that might have been sympathy or might have been warning and said that adjustment took time. Some girls never adjusted. Those girls did not stay long. Mary had wanted to ask what happened to the girls who did not stay, but Catherine had already turned away. Now, lying in bed at midnight, listening to the scratching move across the ceiling in a path that matched exactly where the plans had shown Chamber 4H, Mary thought about the fabric she had found. EM 1864. She had searched the household ledgers during her few free hours, looking for staff records from that year. The ledgers went back to 1828, meticulously maintained, every servant hired and released recorded in the same neat hand. In 1864, the Caldwell house had employed 9 servants. One of them was listed as Ellen Murray, housemaid, hired March 1863, departed September 1864. The notation beside her name was the same as all the others: resigned, sought position elsewhere. But the fabric Mary had found had been inside the wall, not dropped or lost, wedged deliberately into the seam as if someone had pushed it through from the other side, from inside the hidden chamber. The scratching stopped. Mary counted her breaths in the silence. She had been counting everything now. The locked doors in the passages, 17. The empty chambers in the walls, 12 on the 4th floor, at least 8 on the 3rd. She had not yet accessed the lower floors. The names in the ledger marked resigned over the 40 years since the house was built. 63. 63 servants in 40 years for a household that employed 8. The Caldwell family was not unusually demanding. They entertained infrequently. The house, while large, was not the largest on Rittenhouse Square. There was no reason for such turnover unless the servants were leaving for other positions at an extraordinary rate. But Mary had asked carefully among the Irish community, among the networks of girls who worked in the fine houses, and no one remembered servants coming from the Caldwell house. No references given, no recommendations passed along. The house was known but distantly as a place that kept to itself, a place where the staff stayed a long time or left abruptly. Never anything between. Mary rose from bed. She lit her candle and crossed to the corner of her room where the ceiling met the wall. The scratching had stopped here, directly above, before going silent. She pulled her small table to the corner and stood on it, bringing her face close to the plaster. There was a seam, faint, like the one in the wall, but visible if you knew to look for it. A rectangular panel approximately 2 feet by 3 feet, set into the ceiling. No handle, no visible hinge. But the plans had shown a chamber here, and the scratching had come from here. And Mary was suddenly certain with the cold clarity of someone who has spent 3 weeks not sleeping that she was standing beneath a space where someone had been sealed inside. She pressed her palm flat against the panel. The scratching came immediately, directly against her hand. Frantic now. Not rhythmic, not testing, desperate. Mary jerked back and nearly fell from the table. The candle went out. In the darkness, the scratching continued, louder than it had ever been. A sound like fingernails on wood, on plaster, on something solid that would not give. It went on for 10 seconds, 20, and then stopped so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical blow. Mary stood in the dark and shook. Then she climbed down from the table and relit the candle with hands that barely functioned, and sat on the edge of her bed and thought about what she had just felt. The scratching had been immediate, responsive. It had come the moment she touched the panel, as if someone on the other side had been waiting, listening, hoping, someone alive. Mary looked at the ceiling. She looked at the door of her room. She thought about going to Mrs. Graves, to Mr. Tennant, to someone with authority, but she thought about the ledger and the names and the way Catherine had looked at her when she said some girls never adjusted. And she knew with absolute certainty that if she went to Mrs. Graves, whatever was in that ceiling would be gone by morning. And so would Mary. She needed proof. She needed to see inside that chamber, and she needed to understand what the house was before she could decide what to do about it. The next morning, Mary volunteered for a task she had been avoiding: the deep cleaning of the second-floor library, a job that required moving furniture and accessing the upper shelves and would take most of the day. Mrs. Graves had seemed surprised, but assigned her the work without comment. The library was one of the largest rooms in the house, lined floor to ceiling with books the family rarely touched, and it had passages on 3 sides. Mary worked slowly. She dusted, she moved chairs, and she watched the walls. The library's passages were more complex than the upper floors. Multiple routes converging, diverging, creating options for servants to enter from different directions depending on what part of the room required service. The plans had shown all of this, but they had also shown something else. A staircase in the library's west wall passage that descended not to the first floor but to a sub-level marked only as lower service access, restricted. Mary found the staircase entrance at 2:30 in the afternoon. A door in the passage behind the library's west wall, narrow and plain, marked with nothing. It was locked, but the lock was old, simple, the kind that opened with a skeleton key. Mary had seen Mrs. Graves's key ring, 17 keys. She had counted them. She returned to her cleaning. At 4 o'clock, the family took tea in the drawing room. The servants gathered in the basement dining room for their brief afternoon break. Mary excused herself, saying she needed to finish the library before evening. Mrs. Graves nodded without interest. Mary went to the housekeeper's office. The key ring hung on a hook behind the desk. She took it, her heart a hammer, and returned to the passage. The 3rd key opened the door. The staircase beyond was stone, not wood. Older than the rest of the house, or built to seem older. It descended steeply into darkness that swallowed the light from Mary's candle after the first 6 steps. The air was colder here. It smelled of damp earth and something else, something organic and wrong. Mary descended. 12 steps, 20, 30. The walls pressed close. At the bottom was a corridor, low-ceilinged, with chambers opening on both sides. Not servant quarters. The spaces were too small. Too crude. Stone walls, iron doors. Some open, some closed. The open ones were empty. The closed ones had locks on the outside. Mary walked the length of the corridor. There were 8 chambers, 5 open, 3 locked. At the end of the corridor was another door, larger, reinforced with iron bands. It was not locked. Mary opened it. The smell hit her first. Lime. Ash. Decay buried under chemicals meant to suppress it. The room beyond was large, perhaps 20 feet square, with a low vaulted ceiling and a floor that sloped toward a central drain. Against the far wall was a furnace, cold now, but the ash around it was thick and old. Beside the furnace was a workbench with tools Mary recognized from her uncle's farm. Saws, shears, implements for butchering. On the bench was a ledger. Mary crossed the room. Her hands were numb. The ledger was bound in cracked leather, water-stained and old. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as the household staff ledger. Neat, methodical, columns and dates. But these entries were different. No names, only initials and dates and notations that made Mary's vision narrow. E.M., September 1864, resistant, contained 4H, disposed October 1864, AK March 1866, compliant, transferred, no action required, SD November 1867, resistant, contained 3C disposed December 1867. The entries went back to 1831, 3 years after the house was built. They continued to the present year, 1873. The last entry was dated 4 months ago. MP April 1873, resistant, contained 2F disposed May 1873. Mary turned the pages. 42 years, dozens of entries. Most marked resistant and disposed. Some marked compliant and transferred. She did not know what transferred meant. She did not want to know. She found Ellen Murray's entry. E.M., the initials on the fabric, contained in chamber 4H for 1 month before disposal. Chamber 4H, the space above Mary's ceiling. Mary closed the ledger. She looked at the furnace. She looked at the tools on the bench. She thought about the architectural plans upstairs, the chambers marked extended secondary accommodation, the notations about ventilation and isolation. And she understood. The house had not been built with servant passages for efficiency. It had been built with chambers for containment. The Caldwell family did not have high servant turnover because girls left for other positions. They had high turnover because servants who were resistant, who asked questions, who did not adjust, were moved from the passages into the hidden chambers. Isolated, contained. And when they stopped being useful, they were brought here, disposed. Mary stood in the room with the furnace and the ledger and the smell of lime, and tried to breathe. She thought about the scratching in her ceiling, the desperate response when she had touched the panel. Someone was in chamber 4H right now. Someone who had been there long enough to scratch through layers of plaster. Someone who knew Mary was in the room below because they could hear her through the ventilation duct the plans had shown. Someone who had been trying to warn her. Mary picked up the ledger. She held it against her chest and climbed the stone stairs back to the passage. She locked the door behind her. She returned the keys to Mrs. Graves's office. She went back to the library and finished her cleaning, and when the bell rang for evening service, she joined the other servants in the basement and ate her dinner in silence while her mind worked. She could not go to the police. The Caldwells were old Philadelphia money. The police would ask for proof. The ledger was proof. But Mary could not take it without being discovered, and if she was discovered, she would be the next entry. She could not run. She had no money, no reference, and if the ledger was accurate, the house had connections. Transferred suggested other houses, other families, a network. She thought about the architect's name on the plans. J carved. She thought about Mrs. Graves saying many fine houses were adopting similar designs. How many houses? How many families? How many chambers hidden in walls across Philadelphia? That night, Mary did not go to her room. She waited until the other servants were asleep, and then she returned to the passages. She climbed through the routes she had learned, up to the 4th floor, to the door she had never seen, but that the plans showed existed. The door to chamber 4H. It was there. Plain wood. painted the same gray as the passage walls, nearly invisible. There was a bolt on the outside. It was drawn. Mary stood in front of the door and listened. No scratching, no sound at all. She placed her hand flat against the wood. After a moment, someone on the other side did the same. Mary felt the faint vibration, the warmth of a palm pressed against the opposite surface. She spoke quietly, barely a whisper. "I know you're there. I'm going to get you out." The palm stayed against the door for 3 seconds. Then it withdrew. Mary went back to her room. She lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and began to plan. The next morning, she asked Mr. Tennant if the house maintained contact with the architect who had designed the servant infrastructure. Mr. Tennant looked at her sharply. "Why do you ask?" "I was curious about the efficiency of the design," Mary said. "I've never seen anything like it." Mr. Tennant studied her. "The architect is deceased," he said, "many years now. But his son continues the work. He has designed similar systems for other households." Mary kept her expression neutral. "Does he maintain the systems?" "Come for inspections." "When required," Mr. Tennant said. His tone suggested the conversation was over. Mary thanked him and left. But she had what she needed. The architect's son, continuing the work, other households. This was not one house. It was a system, and Mary was going to expose it. But first, she was going to open the door to Chamber 4H. Mary did not open the door to Chamber 4H that night. She returned to her room and sat on the edge of her bed with the knowledge of what lay above her ceiling pressing down like a physical weight. And she forced herself to think. Opening the door would save one person. Maybe. If whoever was inside could still walk, still speak, still survive outside the chamber they had been sealed in. But opening the door would also alert Mrs. Graves and Mr. Tennant and the Caldwell family that Mary knew. And once they knew, she would join the ledger. Resistant, contained, disposed. She needed more than rescue. She needed exposure. She needed to make the system visible to people who could not be disappeared. People with names, with positions, with power that even old Philadelphia money could not simply erase. She needed a journalist. The idea came to her at 4 a.m, watching gray light creep through the ventilation slats near her ceiling. She had read about them in the newspapers her previous employer had discarded. Men who wrote about corruption in city government, about tenement conditions, about the machinery of power that crushed people too poor or too invisible to fight back. The papers called them reformers, muckrakers, men who turned facts into weapons. Mary had facts. She had the ledger entries memorized. She had seen the furnace room. She had the fabric with Ellen Murray's initials. She had architectural drawings that showed a house designed for human containment. And she had something else. Something she had been too frightened to fully consider until now. She had access to the house while the system was still operating, while someone was still alive in the walls. If she could get a journalist inside, if she could show him Chamber 4H with a living person still trapped inside, show him the basement with the furnace still full of ash, show him the ledger with entries dating back 40 years, the Caldwells could not dismiss it as the imaginings of a hysterical Irish servant girl. They could not make it disappear. The question was how to contact a journalist without Mrs. Graves knowing. Servants were not permitted to send letters without the housekeeper's approval. Mary had no day off scheduled for another 2 weeks. She could not simply walk out of the house, but she could be sent out. Mary waited until breakfast. The servants gathered in the basement dining room at 6 o'clock, the same meal every morning. Porridge, bread, weak tea. Mrs. Graves sat at the head of the table and reviewed the day's assignments. When she reached Mary's name, Mary spoke. "I need to visit the apothecary," she said, "for female complaint." The table went quiet. Female complaint was the phrase that ended questions. Mrs. Graves looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "After breakfast duties. Be back within the hour." Mary kept her face neutral. "Thank you, ma'am." She worked through breakfast service, moving through the passages with the same efficiency she had learned over 6 weeks. But her mind was mapping a different route. The apothecary was on Walnut Street, 4 blocks from the house. 2 blocks past the apothecary was the office of the Philadelphia Ledger, one of the city's largest newspapers. She had seen the address on discarded papers, 6th and Walnut. At 8:30, she left through the servants' entrance. The morning was cold, the sky the color of old pewter. Mary walked quickly, head down, her hands thrust into the pockets of her coat. She had hidden the fabric with Ellen Murray's initials in her sleeve. It was not much, but it was something physical, something that could be tested, verified. The Ledger office was a narrow brick building wedged between a printer and a tobacconist. The front room smelled of ink and paper and the particular staleness of a place where men worked through the night. A young man sat at a desk near the door, sorting through a pile of correspondence. He looked up when Mary entered. "Help you?" "I need to speak to a journalist," Mary said. "About a story." The young man's expression suggested he heard this often. "What kind of story?" Mary hesitated. Then she said, "The kind involving dead servants and furnaces in basements." The young man's expression changed. He stood. "Wait here." He disappeared through a door at the back of the room. Mary stood near the entrance, her heart a hammer, watching the street through the window. She had perhaps 40 minutes before Mrs. Graves would expect her back. Less, if she wanted to avoid suspicion. The young man returned with someone else. A woman, perhaps 35, dressed in a plain dark skirt and shirtwaist, her hair pinned severely back. She carried a notebook and a pencil, and her eyes were sharp in a way that made Mary feel simultaneously exposed and safer than she had felt in weeks. "I'm Caroline Rourke," the woman said. "I cover the city for the Ledger. Thomas said you have a story about dead servants." Mary looked at her. She had expected a man. Nearly all the journalists whose names she had seen in papers were men. But Caroline Rourke was looking at her with an expression that suggested she had heard many stories from many frightened women, and that she took each one seriously. And Mary made a decision. "Not just dead," Mary said, "murdered. For 40 years. In a house designed to hide it." Caroline Rourke's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted, focused. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me everything," Mary told her. The passages, the chambers in the walls, the scratching, the architectural plans, the basement room with the furnace and the ledger, the entries marked resistant and disposed. Ellen Murray's fabric. The realization that the house was not unique, that the architect's son was continuing the work in other households. She spoke quickly, aware of the time passing, aware that every minute increased the risk. Caroline Rourke listened without interrupting. She took notes in a shorthand Mary could not read. When Mary finished, Caroline was quiet for a moment. "You're still living in this house," she said. "Yes." "And there's someone alive in the walls right now." "Yes. Chamber 4H. I touched the door 2 nights ago." Someone touched back. Caroline looked at her notes. Then she looked at Mary. "I need to see it," she said. "The chamber, the basement, the ledger. I need to document it before we publish. Otherwise it's just your word against a prominent family." "I can get you inside," Mary said. "But it has to be soon. If they suspect I know, I'll disappear like the others." "Tonight," Caroline said. "What time does the family retire?" 10 o'clock. The servants finish by 11. After that, the passages are empty until 5 in the morning. Caroline nodded. "Give me the address. I'll come to the servants' entrance at midnight. Can you get me inside without being seen?" "Yes," Mary said. "The passages are designed so servants can move invisibly. If you're with me, you'll be invisible too." Caroline wrote down the address. Then she looked up. "If what you're telling me is true, this is the most important story I'll ever write. But it's also dangerous. For both of us. The Caldwells have money. They have influence. If we accuse them of murder and we're wrong, they'll destroy us. And if we're right, and we can't prove it absolutely, they'll still destroy us." Mary pulled the fabric from her sleeve and placed it on the desk. Ellen Murray, housemaid, hired March 1863, departed September 1864. That's what the household ledger says. This was inside the wall of chamber 4H. Her initials, her date, and she didn't depart. She was disposed. Caroline picked up the fabric carefully. She examined the stitching, the date, the initials. Then she folded it and handed it back to Mary. "Keep it safe," she said. "Midnight tonight. If you're not at the door, I'll assume something went wrong and I'll go to the police. Do you understand?" "Yes." Caroline stood. "One more thing. How many houses did you say the architect designed?" "The plans I saw were just for the Caldwell house," Mary said. "But Mrs. Graves said many fine houses were adopting the design. And the butler mentioned the architect's son is still working. I don't know how many." Caroline's expression went distant for a moment, the look of someone calculating something large and terrible. "I'll find out," she said. Mary left the ledger office at 9:15. She walked back to the apothecary, purchased a bottle of tonic she did not need, and returned to the Caldwell house at 9:45. Mrs. Graves was in the kitchen when Mary entered. She glanced at the bottle, nodded, and returned to her ledger. Mary went back to work. She moved through her assigned routes. She dusted the second-floor sitting room, cleaned the silver in the dining room, changed linens in the family bedrooms. And while she worked, she planned. Midnight. The servants' entrance. Caroline Rourke would come through the basement door that opened onto the alley behind the house. Mary would be waiting in the passage just inside. From there, they would go to the basement furnace room first. The ledger was the most important evidence. Then chamber 4H. Then out before the house woke. It would take perhaps 90 minutes. 2 hours at most, if nothing went wrong. At 10:30, the Caldwell family retired. At 11, the servants finished their duties. Mary went to her room with the others, waited until she heard the doors close along the passage, then counted to 500. The house settled into silence. She took her candle and stepped into the passage. The corridors were empty. She moved quickly, down the servant stairs to the basement, through the narrow halls to the door that opened onto the alley. She drew the bolt and waited. Caroline Rourke arrived at exactly midnight. She wore dark clothing and carried a leather satchel. Mary let her in without speaking and led her immediately into the passages. Caroline followed without question. She moved carefully, quietly, with the discipline of someone who had done dangerous work before. Mary led her down the stone stairs to the lower level, through the corridor with the chambers, to the furnace room at the end. The smell hit Caroline the same way it had hit Mary. She stopped in the doorway, her hand going to her mouth. Then she lowered it and stepped inside. Mary lit 2 additional candles. The room emerged from darkness. The furnace, the workbench, the tools. Caroline moved to the bench and looked at the implements without touching them. Then she opened her satchel and removed a camera. Mary had not expected this. The camera was small, portable, the kind journalists used for documentation. Caroline worked quickly, photographing the furnace from multiple angles, the tools, the bench. Then she turned to the ledger. "Open it to the first page," she said. Mary did. Caroline photographed it, turned to the most recent entries. Mary turned the pages, found the entry from 4 months ago. MP April 1873, resistant, contained 2F disposed May 1873. Caroline photographed it. Then she said, "Find Ellen Murray." Mary paged back to 1864. EM September 1864, resistant, contained 4H, disposed October 1864. Caroline photographed it. Her hands were steady, but her face in the candlelight was pale. "How many entries total?" she asked. "I didn't count all of them," Mary said. "At least 60. Going back to 1831. Caroline photographed several more pages at random. Then she closed the ledger and looked at Mary. "Show me the chamber." They climbed back to the 4th floor. The passage outside Mary's room was empty. Mary led Caroline to the door she had found 2 nights before. The door to chamber 4H. Caroline looked at it. Then she looked at Mary. "Have you opened it?" "No. Do it now." Mary's hands were shaking. She reached for the bolt. It slid back with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. She pulled the door open. The smell came first, unwashed human, waste, sickness, then the shape in the darkness. Someone sitting against the far wall of a space barely 4 feet wide. A woman, young, her dress torn and filthy, her hair matted, her face gaunt and pale and terrified. She looked at Mary, then at Caroline, then at the open door behind them as if she could not believe it was real. Caroline stepped forward slowly. She knelt at the threshold. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. The woman's voice was a rasp. She had not used it in some time. Jane Price." "How long have you been here, Jane?" Jane looked at the walls, the ceiling, as if trying to remember. 3 months, maybe 4. "I asked about the ledger, about names I saw. Mrs. Graves said I was confused. That night, Mr. Tennant came to my room. He said I needed to rest. I woke up here." Caroline glanced at Mary, then back to Jane. "Can you walk?" "I don't know." Caroline extended her hand. Jane stared at it. Then slowly, she reached out and took it. Caroline helped her to her feet. Jane swayed, her legs barely holding her. Mary moved to her other side, and together they supported her out of the chamber into the passage. Jane looked around as if seeing the world for the first time. Then she looked at Mary. "You're new," she whispered. 6 weeks, Mary said. "You found me. I heard you. The scratching. I thought no one would hear. I thought I would die here like the others." Caroline was already moving, guiding Jane toward the stairs. "We need to leave. Now, before someone realizes." They made it to the basement. Through the passage to the alley door. Caroline opened it and cold air rushed in, sharp and clean. Jane inhaled as if she had been drowning. They stepped into the alley. Caroline closed the door behind them. She looked at Mary. "Come with us. You can't go back in there." Mary hesitated. She thought about the other servants, Catherine and the others who had looked at her with warning in their eyes, who had survived by not asking questions, who might not survive what came next. "There are others," Mary said. "Servants who don't know. If I leave, they'll be blamed. Or they'll be next." Caroline looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. "I'll have the story published by tomorrow evening. The police will be here by the following morning. Can you stay safe until then?" "I've stayed safe this long," Mary said. She did not believe it, but she said it anyway. Caroline took Jane's arm and led her down the alley toward the street where a carriage was waiting. At the corner, she turned back. "Midnight tomorrow. If you're not out by then, I'm coming back with the police." Mary nodded. She watched them disappear around the corner. Then she turned and went back inside. She locked the door behind her, climbed the stairs, returned to her room, lay in bed and waited for morning. The scratching did not come that night. Chamber 4H was empty, but Mary lay awake anyway, listening to the house breathe around her and counting the hours until the story broke. The Philadelphia Ledger published Caroline Rourke's article on the evening of November 18th, 1873. The headline ran across the entire front page. "House of Horrors on Rittenhouse Square, 40 Years of Murder. Hidden in servant passages, architect designed chambers for human containment. One woman rescued alive after 4 months sealed in walls." The article was exhaustive. 5,000 words. Photographs of the furnace room, the ledger entries, the chamber where Jane Price had been found. Testimony from Jane. Testimony from Mary. Analysis of the architectural plans. A list of 63 names from the staff ledger marked "departed" over 40 years, with no verifiable record of where they had gone. And at the end, a final section that made Mary's hands go cold when she read it. Investigation expands to multiple households. Architect J. Carved designed. Similar systems in 17 Philadelphia residences. Sun continues work in New York, Boston, Baltimore, at least 4 additional houses, confirmed to have hidden containment chambers, authorities estimate. Total victims may exceed 200. The police arrived at the Caldwell house at dawn on November 19th. They brought warrants, engineers, photographers. They emptied the basement. They opened every locked door. They found 2 more bodies in the furnace ash that had not been completely consumed. Mrs. Graves and Mr. Tennant were arrested. The Caldwell family claimed ignorance, but their financial records showed payments to the architect's son as recently as 6 months prior. Payments marked household infrastructure maintenance. The house was seized, the passages were opened, the chambers were documented. And in Chamber 2F, where the ledger said MP had been contained in April and disposed in May, they found scratches on the walls, deep grooves carved with fingernails, words etched in plaster over weeks of slow dying. My name is Margaret Porter. I am 22 years old. I did nothing wrong. Someone please remember. The investigation expanded. 17 houses in Philadelphia, 8 in New York, 5 in Boston, 3 in Baltimore. Not all of them had been used for murder. Some had simply used the chambers for punishment, for isolation, for control. But enough had. Enough that when the final count came in 1875, after 2 years of exhumations and records analysis and forensic examination, the number of confirmed dead was 147. 147 servants, mostly women, mostly immigrants, mostly Irish, Italian, Polish. People whose families were far away or dead. People who could disappear without anyone powerful enough to ask questions. The architect's son was found in a Baltimore boarding house in 1874. He had detailed plans for 23 additional houses in various stages of construction. He hanged himself in his cell before trial. Jonathan Carved, the original architect, had been dead since 1865, but his notebooks, found in his widow's estate, showed that the system had been deliberately designed. The passages were not for efficiency. They were for control, for invisibility, for creating spaces where human beings could be erased without the families who employed them ever seeing or hearing or knowing. One entry in Carved's notebook, dated 1829, read, "The modern household requires the service of inferiors, but should not require their presence. Proper architecture can ensure that the necessary functions are performed by persons who remain perpetually out of sight and, when necessary, out of existence. The enlightened family need never be troubled by the realities of what maintains their comfort." Mary Byrne testified at 7 trials. She told her story again and again. The passages, the scratching, the ledger. The moment she opened the door to Chamber 4H and found Jane Price alive. The Caldwells were convicted of conspiracy and negligent homicide. They served 4 years and were released due to ill health and social connections. Their house was demolished in 1878. Mrs. Graves and Mr. Tennant were convicted of murder. They were hanged in 1876. 17 families across 4 cities were investigated. Most settled quietly, paid restitution to families of the identified dead, claimed they had not known what the chambers were for, that they had trusted their housekeepers, that the architecture had been presented as modern efficiency and they had not asked questions. The houses were opened. Some were demolished. Some were renovated, the passages filled in, the chambers sealed. But some remained standing, and even now, in 1885, 12 years after the Ledger published Caroline Rourke's story, there are houses in Philadelphia with walls that are thicker than they should be, with spaces between the rooms that do not appear on any map, with seams in the plaster that are visible if you know to look for them. Mary Byrne did not return to domestic service. Caroline Rourke hired her as a researcher for the Ledger. Mary spent 3 years documenting servant conditions across Philadelphia, interviewing women who had worked in fine houses, mapping the networks of employment agencies and architectural firms and families who had built their comfort on the invisibility of the people who maintained it. In 1876, she published a book. It was called The Architecture of Erasure: How America's Finest Families Built Murder into Their Homes. It sold poorly. The families it named sued for libel. Most of the suits were settled out of court, but the book was read by journalists, by reformers, by architects who were horrified by what their profession had enabled. by servants who recognized the patterns Mary described and understood, perhaps for the first time, that what had happened to them in houses where they were told to be invisible had not been their fault. Jane Price lived. She testified. Then she moved west, to a city where no one knew her story, and she disappeared into the ordinary anonymity of a life lived on her own terms. Mary received one letter from her in 1880. It said only, "I think of Margaret Porter sometimes, how she carved her name into the wall, how she wanted to be remembered. I remember her. I remember all of them." Caroline Rourke continued her work until she died in 1903. Her obituary in the Ledger mentioned her coverage of tenement reform, of factory conditions, of political corruption. It mentioned the Caldwell House story in a single line, as if it had been one case among many. But it had not been one case among many. It had been the case that revealed how easily human beings could be made to disappear when the architecture of their erasure was built into the structures of daily life. When the people with power decided that invisibility was the same as non-existence. When efficiency became more important than the lives of the people who made that efficiency possible. The carved houses are gone now, most of them, demolished or renovated beyond recognition. But the impulse that created them, the desire to benefit from human labor without acknowledging human presence, that impulse remains. It adapts. It finds new forms, new architectures. Mary Byrne knew this. In the final chapter of her book, she wrote, "The chamber in the wall is not a relic of a barbaric past. It is a tool that reappears whenever one class of people decides that another class is not fully human. The architecture changes. The principles do not. Watch for the spaces that are designed to make people invisible. Watch for the systems that normalize disappearance. Watch for the scratching in the walls. Someone is always there. Someone is always trying to tell you what is happening. Listen." In 1923, during the renovation of a Philadelphia townhouse on Locust Street, workers found a hidden chamber behind a false wall on the 3rd floor. Inside were the remains of a woman. She had scratched words into the plaster before she died. "Help me, please, anyone." The house had been built in 1829 by Jonathan Carved. The chamber had been sealed for 94 years. No one knew her name.